in the book, we actually, one of the struggles in a book like this is to present statistics that basically my grandma can understand, right? That's kind of the goal, right?
Did we hit it? Did you have her read it?
Not yet. I'll let you know.
Okay.
And so, how do you talk about statistically controlling for some of these other things without making it really confusing? And so, if you look in the book, a lot of our tables have what we call unadjusted percentages. It's basically just the raw. If you just looked at what each percentage or what each religious group says, and then we have the second row that's the adjusted percentages, which is basically the percentages after you eliminate differences in education and other sorts of factors. And what we typically find is that on the issues where there are kind of small differences, like the interest in science question, a lot of those differences fade away once you take into account like educational difference. Because we know that education is a big predictor of things like interest in science and things like that. But on the big issues, like evolution, things like that, that stuff doesn't matter, right? Those are more what you might think was like pure religion effects, right? They are about religion at the end of the day. So, yeah.
But when we went into the congregations, we did see definite differences in Latino and African American communities, in particular in the kinds of science issues that they're talking about. More discussion about access to medical care. So we did find some themes of wondering if you can trust the medical community because, of course, of the historic legacy of mistrust. And so, and here's where we got thinking too about access to STEM. So the ability to have a conversation about the cosmos or about evolution or things like this is to some extent a kind of luxury after you have more practical matters dealt with, right? And so I think that shouldn't be missed, and I did appreciate you saying that. And so we did document in the 23 congregations that we studied, which included Latino Protestants, evangelicals, and Catholics, as well as historically black churches. We did find that conversations and debates about evolution were not coming up, or debates about environment were not coming up as well, as much as debates about access to education and debates about access to medical care. And I remember one interview with a black pastor in particular who said to me, when I said, does your congregation talk much about environmental care or climate change? And he said, if I talk to the people in my church who are wondering how they're going to put food on the table every day, about whether or not they should throw away styrofoam cups or use ceramic dishes in the church hall, she said, excuse my language, ma'am, they're going to say, what the hell is wrong with you? And so there's kind of this idea that the first line is getting our practical needs met, and then we have the luxury of talking about other kinds of matters. And so we have, in our broader research, started doing some focus groups here in Houston, and hope to broaden this to other areas of the country, just bringing together groups of pastors from minority communities that are underrepresented in science, and starting to think with them about what it would mean to see a church as a first line of defense in terms of supporting education and STEM access. And so, really hoping that worked. But that work and the desire to do that work was birthed through this project with Chris. I'm really grateful for that. Next.
So I want to talk about the environment for a moment, assuming that for those who are able and willing want to engage in that question. It still can be challenging, and you talk about it a little bit. I think you talked about it as the Al Gore effect, which there was another article that I read a few years ago that was entitled "Environmentalism Yes, Environmentalists Ew." Because people may want to talk about the environment, but don't want to be associated with all those hippies, or if you're slightly more conservative, I don't want to be associated with Al Gore and his liberal politics. And so much of the conversation about science and religion enters into questions of politics. It enters into questions of policy. We're living in this world where we're trying to grapple with a lot of these big questions, including environment and climate change. Are there recommendations that you would give to religious leaders who do want to talk about environment, climate change, other hot button issues? How would you suggest they talk about this and present these things?
yesterday.
Siri speaks.
Please forgive me. No problem.
So the first thing I would say is just that, at least based on, you can probably tell I'm more of a survey data guy than just because I always go back to the survey data, but just based off of our survey numbers, I think the first thing I would tell someone is that this is actually not, at least across religious lines, not quite the controversial issue that I think some people assume it is. If you look at the question that we asked about your attitude about climate change, there are some differences across religious groups, but I don't think nearly as large as people would assume. Even among evangelicals, I don't remember the exact percentages, but I think it was like 30. A good chunk of evangelicals, we'll just leave it approximate, say that yes, the climate is definitely changing and humans are doing it. So I guess I would say, yeah, even if you might think that everyone in your congregation is a hardcore kind of climate, the climate isn't changing at all. There actually isn't much evidence of that. Most likely, there's a really good base in your congregation of individuals who are concerned about this, that don't really see it as controversial.
We did do some statistical analyses where we look at the relative effects of politics versus religion in affecting attitudes towards environment and climate change. And here in evolution, human embryonic stem cell research, reproductive genetic technologies, there is a real religion effect, but for environment and climate, it's more of a political than a religion effect. So having certain political views leads you to reject the idea that humans are involved in climate change. And it's a very particular effect about politics. So religion is sometimes correlated with political views, but if you take out politics, it doesn't seem to be the religion that's the driver as much. And we also found some differences in attendance. So people who attend religious organizations are actually more friendly to environment when compared to those who attend less. So it may be people who are what we call in one article that we wrote from these data, Fox News Christians, right? They may be sitting at home watching Fox News, but they're not necessarily in their churches. I'm being perhaps going to really offend a whole bunch of people. I need you to be here with us tonight. So you need to sort of disentangle. So that's why we coined the Al Gore effect. So people don't necessarily want to be associated with liberal politics, but those who are serious in the sense that they're attending their organizations, their religious organizations, may indeed, as Chris said, be part of a community where people are actually encouraging concern about the environment and the climate in particular. So I want to disentangle that a little bit, the politics versus religion effect. Did you want to say any more on that? Or yeah.
I guess, yeah, sure, why not? I guess the one other thing that we say in the book is to emphasize that that climate and climate change is sort of connected to this issue of human sacredness and humanity, right? That if your neighborhood floods, right, then that affects humans, right? That's not just a science issue, right? And I think that kind of framing would probably gain more traction in many religious communities than just talking about rising temperatures or something like that.
And there was discussion in our interviews in particular where people said, I care about the polar bears, but if you're going to put starving children next to polar bears, I'm going to choose the starving children as a Jew or a Christian or a Muslim. And that makes some sense if you think that humans are sacred, but what's missing there, of course, is that degradation of the environment does hurt the poorest the most, right? If you're next to a polluted factory, if you have money, you're going to move away from the factory pollutants, right? If you don't have money, you have to stay. And so that's very, very important, I think, for scientists, maybe and social scientists, to work together to point that out to faith communities, the ways in which a declining environment also hurts people.
Thank you. I have one last question, and Geoff will have one last question. And then
Oh,
you're done?
I'm done.
We have one last question. Okay.
and then we'll open it up to the audience. So
So
please be
be thinking.
thinking of your questions, and not everyone asks at once. Take, for example, Elaine and Chris, a religious leader who wants to address biomedical technologies or other controversial scientific issues within his or her religious community. But there are no scientists within the membership to tap to for their expertise. Should they still try to have these conversations and engage these topics? And if yes, can you recommend any resources that they can consult besides my church?
Your church does have
Yes,
scientists,
yes.
yes. So we suggest in the book that congregations start by listening to the scientists in their midst. But we know that congregations are often not socioeconomically diverse, they're not racially diverse, that sadly our religious organizations are very homogenous. And so some types of congregations can have scientists and physicians and technology experts in their midst, and some types aren't. So this is a real call for congregations to join together is one kind of thing to think about, that there ought to be congregations that have science resources serving those congregations that don't, is one thing that we talk about. There are also really interesting efforts, web resources. There's the American Association for the Advancement of Science has a very powerful program called the Dialogue on Science, Ethics, and Religion that has a wonderful website. The BioLogos Foundation, which I'm a part of, that was started by Francis Collins, and Harvey Clemens, who's right here in the front row, is a pastor who serves on that board as well. And so that is a web resource that's very accessible, that has videos of scientists talking about their faith for those who are personally religious. It has just easy to access resources. Geoff Mitelman's organization also has a nice website, Sinai and Synapses, which has wonderful resources as well. And so I think there are web resources that are out there. There's the call to serve. There is also, I think, just the power of a pastor or a rabbi or an imam really affirming the possibility that going into science and medicine is an honorable thing to do as a person of faith. So religious leaders do not need to be scientists. They don't need to know everything about science to be effective. They should not underestimate their value as a leader of affirmation into that set of careers. We found, particularly among the evangelical community, that when they have questions about science, that they are much more likely than other communities to turn to pastors with a question about science. We're guessing probably a moral question about science, not the actual mechanisms of science. But religious leaders should not underestimate the kind of authority and power they have to affirm in their particular congregations. So I think it's something to keep in mind as well.
Okay. Thank you. Chris?
Yeah, sure. I guess I'll just add that first I would say don't assume that you don't have any scientists in your congregation, right? Because I think some people might jump to that assumption before even knowing. And tied into that, I would say maybe broaden your definition of what you're looking for a scientist. That you may not have some PhD Rice professor, biologist, or chemist in your congregation, but you may have some nurses, some doctors, some individuals who work in other types of scientific environments that may know quite a bit about certain issues, right? And so, yeah, I think, not making that assumption, and also maybe broadening what you mean or what you're looking for someone who knows things about science would be a good start.
Okay, audience, now it's your turn. I want to give you the 3 guidelines for questions, the ABQs of questions. Make sure they are A, audible, B, brief, and Q, actually a question.
I like it.
And we have staff members roaming around, so we have a question.
Thank you so much for this great discussion. One thing that kind of stood out to me is from the nuances and complexities of your research, that if we really learn what people think and what they believe, it's very different from what because I think in this day and age, in an effort to simplify, we think, okay, Fox News, and now that's what all evangelical Christians think and believe. and the other vice versa, and it's not so. My question was, I'd like to think historically, if we go back so many years, maybe there was a time when there was an acceptance of science as a legitimate source of information. So people in society trusted scientists to give us knowledge of climate change, and that's how decisions in Washington were made, policy decisions, all that. And now we have the situation of versus, So why, what was different then, and what's, has science become such a synonymous with, I guess, secularism and modernism and a threat to people's culture that they've drawn back from it? What was different that they respected science and the information it gave back in the day, or was that not the case?
I guess I still have that. So there was a pretty high degree of trust in science in the past, and there's still actually a pretty high degree of trust in science. So in general, Americans value science. I think that's a truism. There is recent research, and we show some of this in our book, that religious people in particular perceive scientists not to like them, right? So, and then if you think a group is we actually asked, to what extent do you think scientists are hostile to religious people? And actually we got people who really strongly agreed with that. And so if you perceive that a group really doesn't like you, or is, hostile is pretty strong language, then it's going to make it hard for you to relate to that group of people or trust that group of people. And our interviews showed over and over that especially evangelical Christians, some groups of Catholics, think that scientists are perhaps against them. They're not sure they trust scientists. So what's the answer to that? It does, I feel like we're just really pushing this, but I think it's right. There does need to be some more face-to-face interaction to break down stereotypes. As a university professor, I always am the go-to, get people better information. I'm a teacher, I want to show people studies and stuff and convince them. But actually, people's minds tend to change through relationships first, and then once you have a relational tie, then you're more receptive to that relational tie being a conduit of information. You can pass information, transmit information across the tie with someone you trust. And so finding ways for more positive interaction, I think, is a really needed step. I would not underestimate the importance of that.
My name is Fred Smith. I'm with the Houston Graduate School of Theology. And I work a lot in the nexus between religion and health, or faith and health, and work around the country, really around this issue. And I'm really appreciative of bringing in the notion of politics. But I also be interested in bringing about the issue of race. Because one of the issues that I address oftentimes is, which you mentioned before, the Tuskegee experiments and institutions, but also the eugenics work that's done in North Carolina and other places. And for many people, especially in the African American community, science is not seen as a friend. But when we talk about race, the categorization of race, even this false category that was developed by scientific studies in order to separate the race and justify the subjugations of 2/3 of the planet. So, and I think that's in the background, especially in African American communities. When you begin to talk about science, science has not been a friend often. And the sacredness of human life has been more than just a scientific question. It's a justification of my own humanity.
You said it, and I don't know how to make what you said any more amplified. You said it perfectly. So these issues of trust in science are particularly acute and powerful and understandable in certain communities, in particular in Black communities. And we found more so in our interviews and congregational visits in Black churches in particular, that there is for some what we would call a kind of community of memory. Even though you did not personally experience Tuskegee, it is part of the memory of your community. and conditions your possibilities now. And I think that historical legacy should not be underestimated in its importance and what a barrier it is for people going to science. I mean, it really, it's the kind of stories people tell you that stick with you and make you want to keep fighting for the future. Yeah, I can't say anything better, so we need to be very concerned.
I will say, is this working? That
I keep thinking you don't have voice.
I do remember actually at some point us going back and forth many times in email and phone calls about, you know, how are we going to treat race in this book? And at various points we did break out racial differences more, and then we, at some points, basically didn't, I guess. But we did struggle a lot with that, like how do we bring in other variables that are relevant to this without losing kind of focus, you know, in terms of the narrative and so forth.
And I think to the science community, as you I can talk about this for a long time, and the science community needs to understand that just the importance of faith to people in African American and Latino communities. This is not to say, I don't want to misrepresent here, this is not to say that to be black means you're also a Christian. Those things are not synonymous. I want to be careful with my scholarly hat here. But you do have a massive over-representation of African Americans in Christian communities and Latinos in Christian communities, and a massive underrepresentation in science. When you think about, 14%, when I thought that, 14% of the American population, depending on how you define race and the surveys, is black or more, and less than 1% are scientists. I mean, what do you do with that? And then when you couple that with the fact that the way that you get money in American society and access to resources is some kind of training in science, technology, engineering, and math. Even if you don't go into those professions, having had education in those subjects increases the possibilities for you to make more money in the future. So having good STEM background, regardless of what you choose to do, then gives you more possibilities to secure economic future.
Good evening. My name is Gideon Salazar, Protestant evangelical. Did you come across any data that might speak to the idea that because somebody believed in God as a creator, that they were motivated towards the field of science?
I don't think, with our survey data have anything to say about that. But obviously, like, oh, that wasn't here, that was here. Yeah, there were various interviews where people talked about how learning about science or learning about the world then fed back into their faith. That learning about science then made them appreciate their faith more, the sort of the work of God. That didn't always necessarily mean that they went into science as an occupation. I don't know if I have it off the top of my head.